Thylacosmilus is one of the strangest animals we know of in the fossil record, and on the surface that doesn't really make sense. This is mostly because when you look at it, it pretty much looks like Smilodon or any other saber-toothed cat. Thylacosmilus was smaller than Smilodon. It was around the size of a leopard as opposed to a large lion, or even a little bit bigger like in Smilodon. But there's still obvious comparisons, especially with those teeth. But it wasn't a cat. In fact, it wasn't very closely related to them at all. There were millions of years of evolution separating Thylacosmilus and Smilodon. So what made it have so much convergence with Smilodon? Notably with the very long canine teeth, the short head, and the very cat-like body. Well, there's a lot of reasons it had these adaptations, and not all of them were for the same reasons that Smilodon had those adaptations. In order to understand what separates Smilodon, the saber-toothed cats, and Thylacosmilus, we need to go back in time, much further than when any of them lived, even up to just a few thousand years ago in the case of Smilodon, and up to only about 3 million years ago in the case of Thylacosmilus. Instead, we need to go back almost 200 million years ago. This is when Pangea first started to break up, during the early part of the Jurassic. And in South America, some of the mammals got separated, and that means there were a lot more marsupial-like mammals. These are called metatherians, and they're not all marsupials, it's just things that are closer to marsupials than to things like the placentals. And the placentals just mean they have a highly complex placenta. So think of humans and cats, and basically any mammal that gives live birth and doesn't use a pouch. Thylacosmilus fits really well into this group of metatheria, but it wasn't a marsupial like kangaroos, possums, or koalas are. Instead, it was from a separate group that has specifically only been found in South America. Those are called sparassodonts, and they're generally carnivorous or at least omnivorous, and seem to have been somewhat dominant predators in some parts of the Cenozoic in South America, although they didn't really achieve great success until after the dinosaurs died. One of the main pieces of evidence that the sparassodonts are separate from the marsupials is the fact that in general they could get to larger sizes. There's only one really large marsupial predator, Thylacoleo, coming from Australia. Meanwhile, Thylacosmilus was joined by a whole host of other relatively large predators, meaning that it wasn't alone and it wasn't just a fluke that it as an individual species got so large. There was an entire group of them that got large. And this means they may have had slightly different metabolisms when compared with things like marsupials. And that's because in the marsupials, they generate most of their heat through muscle action. Meanwhile, placentals, like us, have brown adipose tissue. And this is some kinds of fat that actually have a lot of mitochondria in it. This brown adipose tissue is really useful in placental mammals for maintaining their body heat. And because the sparassodonts were able to get so large, maybe they also had it. It's hard to tell, and until we get something with soft tissue that shows this kind of fatty tissue, which would in and of itself be even stranger to find, it is really hard to say for sure whether or not they have this heightened metabolism. However, there are still other features, and that's because they have highly reduced epipubic bones. The epipubic bones in marsupials are really, really big, and that's because they're supporting the pouch that you normally think of when you think of marsupials. So in kangaroos, the reason the pouch actually exists is because these epipubic bones are really big and can support that extra structure. But sparassodonts don't have this, so it suggests they potentially didn't have a pouch. Now I say potentially because there are some marsupials, such as the now extinct thylacine, which actually had cartilage instead of bone there. And cartilage doesn't really fossilize, so potentially the sparassodonts did have that kind of structure. But again, it's just helping to show that the sparassodonts were doing something different than the marsupials. Now I've been spending this video showing why Thylacosmilus and its sparassodont relatives aren't actually marsupials, but there are still things that do connect them to the marsupials. For example, placental mammals have 3 molar teeth. Meanwhile, when you look at things like the marsupials, they have 4, and the sparassodonts, sure enough, have 4 molar teeth. So it is pretty strongly suggested that the sparassodonts were really closely related to marsupials without actually being marsupials. And the subject of teeth brings us back to Thylacosmilus, because that's kind of what it's all about, and now we do know what it was, but not necessarily how it was. How it hunted or fed, or how it's different from other sparassodonts, because some of the earlier sparassodonts, like Lycopsis, still had relatively long skulls. And boar hyena also had a relatively short skull, but it was missing the two really important things you would expect, those giant canines. And the obvious comparison here is to the saber-toothed cats like Smilodon. And while it seems obvious, they're still pretty different. When you think about Smilodon, its teeth are thin and blade-like, kind of like a K-bar. And if you're wondering why I'm talking about a military knife during this, it's because Thylacosmilus also had teeth that were kind of like a particular military knife. And that's some of the trench knives that were used in the First World War, especially the triangular ones that were good only for stabbing. And actually they're war crimes to use now because it's really hard to stitch up those wounds, but it helps to show how just entirely different these different teeth were. Because while Smilodon could actually slash and cut into things with its teeth, Thylacosmilus really couldn't. And that's really not all that's different between these two different animals. And when you compare their skulls, the difference is actually really obvious as you start looking in better detail. For example, if you look at the chin of both animals, Thylacosmilus doesn't have a bony symphysis. A symphysis is where two flat bones come into contact with one another and fuse with ligaments in order to hold together. You have a symphysis in the middle of your jaw, where each side of your mandible comes together and fuses. Smilodon had the same thing, where it was large and very bony. Thylacosmilus had one, but it was tiny, so it was not doing the same kind of thing. We can also look at some of the molars in Thylacosmilus, which are very small and reduced, as opposed to in things like Smilodon, where they're much larger and actually sharpened into carnassials, which is just the name that we give to molars in things that are more predatory. It just means that they're sharpened molars. Smilodon also had a large infraorbital foramen, and this is just a hole in the skull that let nerves pass to the front part of the face. Meaning if you're hunting something, you can actually use parts of your face to feel what's happening, especially when you think about modern day cats where they have whiskers and potentially even use those whiskers to detect the pulse of what they're hunting. Meanwhile, in Thylacosmilus, it had a really small infraorbital foramen. So it really wasn't feeling a lot with its face. It wasn't important for it to have highly sensitive whiskers. Additionally, Thylacosmilus's canines weren't quite as shallow as things like Smilodon's. Instead, the reason it has this kind of odd domed head shape is because those canines went all the way back. They were very deep rooted, going very far back into the skull. And moving back to the front teeth, not the canines though, you can look at the incisors and see the difference. In Smilodon, there's very large, sharp incisors for helping to cut meat off a bone. Thylacosmilus had no incisors on the top jaw, and maybe none or occasionally some very small ones on the bottom jaw. In fact, some researchers think that this gap in the front of its mouth may have actually allowed it to have a strong and muscular tongue, which it also could have manipulated organs or help pull soft meat off of bone. It wasn't using its incisors to do anything with shearing meat. So whatever its hunting strategy or feeding strategy was, it was entirely different than Smilodon. And that also shows in some of the post-head material, the post-crania, because it was also semi-plantigrade. And when we talk about plantigrade, semi-plantigrade, and digitigrade things are animals like cats, where they walk on the digits, not the whole hand. So for example, if we look at it in humans, it would be like walking on just your toes and the balls of your feet. You'd be raised up like this, with your heel entirely off the ground. Meanwhile, semi-plantigrade just means your heel isn't necessarily always on the ground, but it is a lot closer. And when we think about other plantigrade animals, we can think of things like bears, which are actually pretty good at covering long distances, but also the best long distance runners of them all. Us, because we are plantigrade. Our heels go all the way onto the ground, and it makes us really great at running long distances, even if I'm not as good as I used to be at it. Because of these visual differences, these researchers actually did finite element analysis, or FEA, and that's a growing field in paleontology where you take a lot of measurements of different parts of the organism, make a 3D model, and then put it into a physics simulator to understand how it would have dealt with different stresses and pressures, and actually how it could have even potentially deformed, and how well it would have been resistant, or how well it would have actually been deformed by different stresses. So here's the models, and they actually go in pairs. So up and down is the same organism in the same test, but with one of these looking at stress and the other looking at deformation. The bluer ones are the contour plots of just the stress, meaning it's kind of like a topographic map, where a single line on a topographic map is all the same elevation, A single color in these kind of stress plots mean it's all the same stress in that color. The greener ones are the deformation plots, which are exaggerated by 100 times to help show the differences, but they basically show the same thing, which is that when Thylacosmilus bit into something and stabbed its teeth into something, it dealt with more stress. But when pulling and shaking side to side, it had significantly less stress. So its skull was much better at those two things when compared to Smilodon. It was better at pulling and it was better at shaking into things. This is really shown by the deformation plots in the side to side shaking, where you can see the Smilodon teeth, again, exaggerated deformation, but they're moving more to the side than in Thylacosmilus. So Thylacosmilus was much better at this kind of shaking motion than Smilodon was. But the tests went beyond this, and that's because these are digital models. They can change them. They can do things like make that tooth root much shallower, and they did that in some of these tests. And what they found is that when the tooth root is shallower, it actually increases the deformation of the skull in both the side-to-side shaking and the pulling actions. Meanwhile, the stabbing action isn't actually affected that much. But there's also another change they made, and that's removing the post-orbital bar. So post means behind and orbit is the eye. So when you think about this animal and you actually look at it and its skull, you can see that the eye is kind of framed really well. And that's kind of strange when you consider other things, like Smilodon, which doesn't have this bar, or dogs, which don't have this bar. There's a lot of animals and mammals that don't have this bar, even related things like possums. Even other sporastodonts, like boar hyena, don't have this bar. But a few of the other sporastodonts that are much closer related to Thylacosmilus do. So whatever this group was doing, that bar behind the eye had something to do with it. And so by removing it digitally in these models, the same tests were ran, and there's actually a number of things that are pretty important when we understand what this animal may have been doing. Removing this bar actually increased the deformation compared to the original during both the stabbing and pulling situation, and increased the stresses on the zygomatic arch, which is one of the main structures in the mammal's skull that many of the muscles actually go through. For us, it's our cheekbones, right here. And that's because we have a muscle that runs from here down to here to help power our jaws. The same thing applies to other mammals, just they don't have quite the same pronounced cheekbones. But arguably the most important deformation is the fact that the brain case would deform. And deforming around such an important organ is not ideal to say the least. So it seems like this post-orbital bar actually really helped to stabilize the skull, which is really interesting because it's a really small feature and we don't actually see it in any other mammals that I know of other than maybe primates that have forward-facing eyes that are more or less boxed in. So it's something that's really unique and I really hope there's more study on this in the future. But we can at least tell that it was very important for Thylacosmilus. So Thylacosmilus was very different from the other animals we normally think about in the fossil record. And that also brings us back to the rest of the teeth that I mentioned are different between Thylacosmilus and Smilodon. Because when I mention the things like, hey, Thylacosmilus doesn't have incisors, but Smilodon does, that brings up a question. What other mammals don't have incisors? And there's one animal that actually makes a lot of sense because it also has enlarged canine teeth. It's the walrus. And if you're thinking, how does a walrus have anything to do with this? They have a very interesting feeding strategy because they mostly eat mussels and clams, and they don't have incisors so that they can suck up the soft bodies of those mussels and clams easier. So potentially what Thylacosmilus was doing was feeding on just the soft tissues of whatever it killed and or was feeding on if it was feeding on carrion. And this makes sense when you consider the back teeth too being reduced, because animals like the cheetah, for example, they need to eat fast and then get off the carcass because they're small. They will be killed by lions or hyenas or other animals that are trying to poach their kill. So they really focus on just the soft tissues, meaning that they also have this same kind of reduced teeth that you see in Thylacosmilus. So whatever Thylacosmilus was doing, it was getting in, getting its soft organ meats, and getting out. It did not want to spend a lot of time there because it wasn't built to eat those tougher muscle meats. All of this has led researchers to suggest that it really wasn't a hunter or it had a very poorly understood hunting style, but that it was probably a scavenger. And whatever it found, it would rip open the body of and then eat those soft organ meats and then leave off to the next one. And long distance running from the semi-plantigrade feet would help that because it could travel those long distances more efficiently. It's a very, very specialized niche, and that came into a problem towards the more recent day when a lot of changes were happening in South America. One of the most notable changes in South America around the time that the Sparassodonts and Thylacosmilus went extinct was that the placentals were actually starting to reach South America. But some more careful dating of the different fossils of these animals shows that no, it seems like the Sparassodonts actually went extinct before the placental predators actually made it there. So it really wasn't them, there was potentially other issues, and researchers looked into this too. This team of researchers looked at a number of different things, and they used a lot of statistics tests to try and be able to understand why exactly this was the case. And these authors tested three main things. The first is the Sparassodonts themselves. What was their diversity like? What was their body size like? How did those factors interact? How did the Sparassodonts in general do? Then they tested how the Sparassodonts may have interacted with potential prey species. Because if one group of prey species goes extinct, you're going to have less to feed on, and there's a lot of different indications on what that could mean for the overall group. And then finally, they tested how the Sparassodonts' diversity and other factors actually coincided with changes to the climate and other factors that aren't directly related to the living parts of their environment. And they found kind of a multi-cause situation was probably happening. Because as Sparassodonts got larger, they became less diverse. They became more specialized into specific roles. And this means that just they weren't able to stay diverse. These plots show this really well. The red line is the extinction rate, and the blue line is the speciation, so the number of new species evolving. And the right is based on the number of specimens, and the left is based on only the number of species. But you can see there's a gradual drop in the rates, both of extinction, but also speciation. And that speciation part is important because even if extinction rates are going down, if you're not evolving into new things, that could still mean your group is going extinct. Meanwhile, if you simplify it to just the diversification rates, you can actually see that diversification rate ending up in the negative, which if a group is becoming less diverse, that means species are dying in that group. And functionally, that group is going extinct. You can think of it this way. If you have 5 species in a group, and 4 of them die out, you only have 1 left. And if that one, in that same amount of time it took those 4 to die, diversified into 5 other species and the original, you're increasing your diversity because now you have 6 species of that group. But if it didn't, and you only lost 4 and this one did nothing but stayed alive, you're losing diversity. Your group is fundamentally going extinct, which is what it seems like happened with the Sparassodonts. And then there's the less direct things, and these are using correlation parameters, which is a statistics test you can use. And it's important to remember correlation isn't causation. Just because there's a strong correlation doesn't mean that's the exact reason that the Sparassodonts went extinct, just that it could be important. And there's some statistics tests you can actually do to see how important that correlation might have been. And on this graph, the GI is in blue, and it means, hey, there's speciation because of this. Meanwhile, GN is for extinction, and that means, hey, there's extinction because of this. And you can see there's a lot of different bars on here that could mean different things, especially when some of them actually show, hey, there's some speciation because of this, but also, hey, there's some extinction because of this. It shows that there's a really complicated relationship between Sparassodonts and each of these features. What's really important though is when you're looking at the Astrapatheres and the Litoterns, they went extinct, and that extinction seems to have had a major effect on the diversity and extinction rates of the Sparassodonts. And then you move into things like the non-living factors, where there are smaller but still notable changes, with, for example, the level of CO2 having the most significant effect on the Sparassodonts. What all of this data means is actually really well exemplified by Thylacosmilus. It went extinct not because of any one factor, but many factors. It was large, meaning it couldn't diversify as quickly, and the diversity in Sparassodonts as a whole had decreased as they got larger. And then some of the prey items died, so there was another decrease in the Sparassodonts. And then finally again, as the ice started to form because of the drop in CO2 that cooled global temperatures, the environment got drier. And Thylacosmilus, as one of these final Sparassodonts, just couldn't handle it. It couldn't handle losing its prey. It was too specialized to adapt to some sort of new niche. and as its prey left, it also ended up leaving too. Not to anywhere new, but just leaving us to extinction. And as I'm ending this, I'm honestly kind of sad because this is such an interesting group of mammals. And Thylacosmilus, like I've mentioned, is nothing like anything we have today or anything else in the fossil record, other than a handful of very closely related animals that aren't nearly as well preserved. So it's really unfortunate that all of these factors did kind of conspire to cause the extinction of the Sparassodonts, and that's unfortunate. So while I started this video comparing Thylacosmilus and Smilodon and the other saber-toothed cats, I really hope you come away with this understanding that no, Thylacosmilus was entirely unique and genuinely unlike anything else that had lived on the planet. So you probably heard me mention statistics and computer modeling during that video. And the thing is, I'm not good at either of those subjects. Computers I'm terrible with, and also statistics I'm terrible with. The one statistics class I actually took was actually during the first part of COVID, so I remember almost none of it. Meanwhile, I'm looking around and seeing how many of these papers use a lot of statistics to help prove their points. And that's what makes me very happy to work with the sponsors of this video, Brilliant. Brilliant offers a wide range of classes, covering many different topics, including computers and programming, but also for me, more importantly, statistics, which is great because I've needed to go back and really learn some of those things that I was supposed to learn when I took the class for a long time now. And the thing is, if you're not super into things like statistics, there's plenty of other things like algebra and calculus and physics, and they're always adding more content to their platform, meaning no matter what time of year it is, you're always going to be able to find something new to learn about. This makes Brilliant the best platform there is for getting a refresher on things that you've learned before, exploring something totally new, or even as a tutor for things that you're already trying to learn about. All of these lessons are actually interactable too, so it's not just reading a textbook. There's more going on than just that, which makes it a really valuable tool. You can start for free using the link below, and the first 200 users to use that link will receive a 20% discount off of their annual subscription. So you can find that link below at brilliant.org/raptorchatter.